The twisted murder of Jessica Padgett. Posthumous abuse shocked the nation. Jessica's life and disappearance. Jessica Padgett was a woman like many others, living a life filled with both joy and hardship, love and routine. At 33, she was a mother of 3, trying to juggle the responsibilities of motherhood with the daily grind of work. She lived in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. For Jessica, family came first, and she had a special bond with her mother, Danelle, and her stepfather, Gregory. On the morning of November 21, 2014, Jessica's day started like any other. She had dropped off her children at daycare. 2 of her children were in school, and the youngest was still in preschool, and made her way to her mother's house. Danelle, her mother, was in Florida at the time, but Jessica and her stepfather, Gregory, were close. Jessica needed to use the fax machine at Danelle's house, an errand she had done countless times before. Gregory was at work, leaving Jessica alone at the house for a short time. What happened next would become a chilling chapter in the Padgett family's history. As was typical for her, Jessica did not plan to be gone long. But by midday, something went terribly wrong. She never returned to the daycare to pick up her children. The hours ticked by, and there was no sign of Jessica. Her family, knowing that this was unlike her, quickly became concerned. They attempted to reach her, but her phone went unanswered. Her keys and purse, along with her car, were found abandoned outside a Dollar General store, strangely, in a parking lot several miles away from her mother's house. But where was Jessica? What had happened? The discovery of Jessica's car, alone and unlocked, raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of a struggle. The car had been carefully parked, and it was positioned in a way that suggested no immediate danger. But something about the situation felt wrong. It wasn't just the abandoned car, it was the absence of Jessica herself. Her family, especially her mother, Danelle, was gripped by a gut-wrenching sense of loss. They began searching for her, calling her friends, and contacting local authorities. The police began a search, but despite their efforts, there was no trace of Jessica. Over the next few days, investigators pieced together a few disturbing clues that hinted at a much darker reality. Security footage from nearby stores showed a truck resembling Gregory's parked close to Jessica's car. Initially, this was brushed off as circumstantial evidence, but with each passing hour, the investigation took a more sinister turn. Danelle, frantic and desperate to find out what had happened to her daughter, had no idea that the person she trusted most in the world, her husband Gregory, was hiding a terrifying secret. Gregory's actions during the search were odd and unsettling. He initially cooperated with the police and even joined in the efforts to locate Jessica, but there was something off about his behavior. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm. And when police pressed him further about the details of Jessica's visit that morning, the inconsistencies in his statements began to surface. Gregory initially told investigators that Jessica had come to the house to use the fax machine, but there was a glaring problem with this story. Danelle's fax machine was operational, and when investigators checked the phone records, they confirmed that Jessica had, in fact, sent a fax from Gregory's house that morning. The details weren't adding up. Inconsistencies in Gregory's story began to raise alarm bells. The more investigators dug, the more troubling the picture became. They uncovered a history of strained relations between Gregory and Jessica's husband, Micah. Tensions had been simmering for some time, especially after Jessica and Micah had moved back in with Donnell and Gregory. What seemed like a straightforward case of a missing person began to evolve into something much darker. Gregory's involvement in the disappearance of Jessica went from being a mere suspicion to a certainty. But no one could have anticipated just how horrifying the truth would turn out to be. As the search for Jessica stretched into its third day, the mounting frustration and confusion began to turn into something more. Donnell, still frantic, started to sense that something wasn't right. Her daughter had always been responsible, always kept in touch, and never left her children or her family in such a state of limbo. The fact that her car had been found, abandoned in a random parking lot, was the first sign that something was deeply wrong. And then there was Gregory. Initially, Gregory's behavior had seemed almost too normal. He cooperated with law enforcement, joined in the search efforts, and kept in touch with Jessica's family. But Donnell began to notice small things, little inconsistencies in his words, minor oddities in the way he spoke about Jessica's disappearance. He claimed that Jessica had come to his house to use the fax machine. But the more the investigators dug into this claim, the more holes appeared. The police were thorough, and soon, the discrepancies in Gregory's statements could no longer be ignored. First, the timeline of Jessica's visit became problematic. Security footage from nearby businesses revealed that Gregory's truck was parked near Jessica's car, not long after she had been last seen. This was not just a passing coincidence. It was a critical clue that investigators could not dismiss. Gregory had also mentioned that Jessica had stayed at his house for some time that morning, but this conflicted with other pieces of evidence. The fax machine, which he claimed she had used, was still functioning properly. In fact, Jessica had sent a fax that morning, and this was confirmed through phone records, which placed her at his house long before the car was found. But the inconsistencies didn't end there. Investigators learned that Gregory's history with Jessica's husband, Micah, was less than cordial. There had been tension for months between Gregory and Micah, stemming from unresolved family issues. Jessica and Micah had moved back in with Donnell and Gregory to temporarily escape their financial troubles, which created friction in an already strained household. Gregory had always resented Micah, but there was more to it: underlying feelings of animosity and even jealousy. Gregory's resentment toward Jessica's husband began to surface as the investigation continued. It was becoming clear that there was more to Gregory's actions than just a random family visit. Investigators also began to explore Gregory's relationship with Jessica more closely. On the surface, everything had appeared normal. Gregory had often seemed like a loving stepfather, but deeper scrutiny revealed troubling signs of manipulation. He had always been close to Jessica, and while this was not unusual for a stepfather, the investigators began to wonder, was there something more beneath the surface? Did Gregory's feelings toward Jessica transcend what should have been a familial bond? By the fifth day of the investigation, it became apparent that the authorities needed to confront Gregory. They couldn't ignore the mounting suspicions any longer. With the physical evidence piling up, it was time for them to press him on his involvement. The investigators called Gregory in for a formal questioning session. At first, Gregory stuck to his story: Jessica had simply come to his house to use the fax machine. But as the questions grew more pointed and the pressure mounted, Gregory's facade started to crack. He couldn't explain the conflicting evidence, and the inconsistencies in his statements became too glaring to ignore. The police knew they were getting closer to the truth. It was in the hours that followed, as Gregory sat under intense interrogation, that the truth started to emerge. Gregory's initial reluctance to speak eventually gave way to his own admissions. It began with small, hesitant confessions, each one more disturbing than the last. Gregory admitted that Jessica had indeed come to his house on the morning of her disappearance. But it wasn't for the innocent reason he had initially claimed. He lured her there with the lie of false pretense that he needed help with his computer. Jessica had trusted him, as she always had, and went to him for what she thought was a routine errand. Once inside, however, the situation took a horrific turn. Gregory, driven by a twisted combination of resentment and his own disturbing desires, murdered Jessica. He shot her in the back of the head, an act that was as cold and calculated as it was brutal. Afterward, he dragged her lifeless body into a bedroom, further sealing the gravity of his crime. Gregory's confession was chilling. He had carefully planned the murder. The premeditated nature of his actions was clear. But the depth of his depravity didn't stop with the killing. After he had killed Jessica, he staged the scene to mislead investigators. He drove Jessica's car to the Dollar General parking lot, parked it in such a way that it appeared she had been there on her own accord. He moved the seat forward, creating the illusion that she had driven the vehicle herself, possibly to throw off suspicion. But Gregory's sickening actions didn't end there. To the horror of investigators, Gregory later admitted to filming himself engaging in unimaginable acts with Jessica's lifeless body. He described in graphic detail how he had sexually abused her corpse after her death, a depraved and unthinkable violation of the trust that Jessica had placed in him. The confession left everyone who heard it stunned, but it was the only way the investigators could fully understand the grotesque nature of the crime. Despite his shocking confessions, Gregory showed no remorse. As he spoke, there was no hint of guilt or regret in his voice. He spoke with the coldness of someone recounting a mundane errand, not the savage murder of someone he was supposed to love. His lack of empathy, his inability to grasp the horror of his actions, painted a picture of a man whose moral compass was completely broken. The more the investigation dug into Gregory's confession, the more horrifying the details became. What had initially seemed like a tragic disappearance was rapidly transforming into a chilling tale of premeditated murder and unthinkable desecration. Gregory's actions were becoming clearer, and with each new revelation, the entire community was shaken to its core. When Gregory admitted to killing Jessica, it was as though a dark veil had been lifted, exposing the depths of his depravity. However, it was not just the murder that disturbed the investigators, it was what came after. His actions were far from the actions of a man who had snapped in a moment of rage. Instead, they revealed a man who had meticulously planned the crime, knowing exactly what he was doing and for what sick reason. Gregory had lured Jessica to his home under the false pretense of needing help with his computer. The moment she arrived, he shot her in the back of the head, ending her life in an instant. The brutality of the act itself was unfathomable. Yet, what followed was even more disturbing. Once Jessica lay dead, Gregory did not panic. He did not flee. Instead, he methodically moved her body, dragging it into a bedroom where he could take his time. But the horror did not end there. Gregory was far from finished with Jessica. After ensuring that her life was extinguished, he began a grotesque and depraved act that would haunt those who uncovered it for the rest of their lives. In a chilling and incomprehensible display of his twisted desires, Gregory filmed himself abusing Jessica's lifeless body. The details of these videos were so disturbing that even the seasoned investigators were shaken. They discovered video after video on Gregory's computer, each one more grotesque than the last. These were not just images captured in the heat of the moment, they were cold, deliberate actions that reflected a man's deep-seated sickness. Gregory later admitted that these acts were not random. He had been inspired by his own fantasies. His resentment, combined with a twisted addiction to pornography, led him down this dark path. He claimed that it was his obsession with sex toys and pornography that had pushed him to such extremes. As terrifying as it sounded, Gregory's admission of his motivation was an attempt to justify his actions, to explain how a man like him could commit such unspeakable acts. But his reasoning was hollow, and there would be no understanding for what he had done. After killing Jessica and desecrating her body, Gregory had a chilling plan to cover his tracks. He staged the scene in a way that would confuse investigators and shift the blame onto an accidental disappearance. He took Jessica's car and drove it to a Dollar General parking lot, far from his home. He positioned the car so it looked like Jessica had been there on her own, adjusting the driver's seat forward to make it appear as though she had been driving. In his mind, the scene would be one that looked like an ordinary errand gone wrong. He carefully thought through every detail, making sure to create a facade of normalcy to mislead the police. The question, of course, was whether anyone would buy into his carefully crafted illusion. As the investigation continued, the grim details of Jessica's final moments slowly came together. While Gregory's manipulation of the scene had initially thrown investigators off course, his confession revealed everything. He admitted to the staged car placement, explaining how he had driven her vehicle to the Dollar General parking lot and arranged it to mislead the authorities. What he failed to understand, however, was that no amount of planning could erase the truth. His actions were too calculated, too deliberate, for him to ever escape the consequences of what he had done. The final blow came when Gregory led authorities to the location of Jessica's body. He had hidden her in the backyard, behind a shed, under a pile of leaves. It was here, in this desolate spot, that her body had been left to rot. The sight was almost unbearable. She had been discarded, as though her life had meant nothing to him. But Gregory's confession made one thing clear: he had not just murdered Jessica, he had robbed her of her dignity, her life, and her humanity. He had committed a crime that no one could understand, a crime that violated every moral and ethical code. When Jessica's body was discovered, it was a moment of painful closure for her family, but it was also a bitter reminder of the horror she had endured. Her children, who had been left without their mother, would never know the truth of what happened that day, at least not in full. Her mother, Danelle, would carry the weight of that loss for the rest of her life, struggling to come to terms with the fact that the man she had trusted had been the one to destroy everything she loved. But while Jessica's body had been found, the full extent of Gregory's depravity still hadn't been fully realized. The investigation turned toward his background, his motives, and what had driven him to such extremes. In his confession, Gregory painted a picture of a man who had been consumed by his own inner demons. His resentment, his obsession with pornography, and his deep-seated anger had all come together in a way that led to Jessica's murder. Gregory had been a man living in a world of his own making, a world where he had justified his actions to himself with sickening logic. In his mind, he had a right to take Jessica's life and violate her in the most unimaginable way. What he didn't realize, however, was that the justice system would not let him escape this crime. His actions had irrevocably destroyed any chance he had of ever finding redemption. He was, in the end, a man consumed by his own darkness, and there would be no escape from the consequences of what he had done. The discovery of Jessica Padgett's body marked both a painful closure and a new, even darker chapter in the unfolding story. In the early days of the investigation, law enforcement had been grasping for answers, following one lead after another, hoping for a breakthrough that would bring Jessica back home. But it wasn't until Gregory's chilling confession that the search would come to its horrifying end. On the morning of the discovery, the investigation had reached a critical point. Gregory had already been taken into custody, his statements increasingly erratic, his guilt undeniable. When questioned about the whereabouts of Jessica's body, he reluctantly agreed to lead authorities to the place where he had hidden her. The investigators, now fully aware of his disturbing actions, followed him to the secluded spot behind his house, where he had concealed the body with chilling indifference. The location was a small patch of land at the edge of his backyard, a place where most people would never venture. There, tucked beneath a pile of leaves, lay Jessica's lifeless form. The scene was more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. It wasn't just the fact that Jessica had been killed, it was the callousness with which Gregory had disposed of her. Her body, hidden away as though she were nothing more than an object to be discarded, was a stark reminder of the violence and disregard he had shown for her life. As investigators carefully uncovered the layers of leaves, it became clear that Gregory had made no effort to conceal his actions. He had simply left her there, abandoned, as though she had never mattered. Her life, her children, and her family were erased with a single act of cruelty. For Jessica's mother, Danelle, the moment was an emotional earthquake. The search for her daughter had been grueling, marked by long nights of uncertainty and fear. She had clung to the hope that Jessica might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found. But the reality of what had happened to her daughter was more than Danelle could bear. Her grief was compounded by the knowledge that the man who had murdered her daughter was someone she had trusted, someone who had been a part of her life for years. Gregory had not just taken Jessica's life, he had shattered the very foundation of her family. Danelle and the rest of Jessica's family were forced to confront a new, unspeakable truth. Jessica's murder was not just an act of violence, it was a violation that went beyond physical harm. It was the breaking of a sacred trust. Gregory had been a fixture in their lives, a man they had known and loved. To discover that he had murdered Jessica and hidden her body in such a cold, calculated manner left them feeling betrayed in a way that words could not describe. This was not just a loss, it was the theft of a future Jessica had hoped for and dreamed about for her children. The moment the body was uncovered, the investigation shifted into its next phase, the forensic analysis. The authorities meticulously examined every aspect of the scene, trying to piece together the final moments of Jessica's life. The forensic team recovered Jessica's body and began the painstaking process of autopsy and analysis. The details of her death were grim: shot in the back of the head, the bullet having struck her with a force that ended her life in an instant. The nature of the wound suggested the crime was quick, but there was no doubt that it was premeditated. Gregory had planned every step, from luring her to his home to executing the murder with precision. The autopsy revealed other disturbing facts, confirming the nature of the violation that had taken place after Jessica's death. Gregory had not only killed her, he had inflicted further harm by desecrating her body in the most horrific way. The extent of the abuse was clear in the forensic evidence, and the investigators were left grappling with the grotesque reality of what Gregory had done to his stepdaughter. The violation was not only physical but deeply psychological. It became increasingly apparent that Gregory had seen Jessica as nothing more than an object, a vessel for his twisted desires. The complete disregard for her humanity was haunting. The discovery of Jessica's body also marked the beginning of a deeper emotional toll on the family. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of emotions: disbelief, sorrow, anger, and betrayal. The pain of losing a loved one is unimaginable, but for Donnell and the rest of Jessica's family, the trauma was compounded by the knowledge that the person responsible for the crime was someone they had welcomed into their home. The betrayal went beyond anything they could have anticipated. They had trusted Gregory, and he had shattered that trust in the most unforgivable way. As the investigation continued, the psychological toll on Jessica's family grew. Donnell struggled to come to terms with the brutality of the crime, constantly replaying the moment she had learned of Jessica's disappearance. She was unable to understand how the man she had once called family could have been capable of such evil. How could someone who had been a part of their lives for so long have harbored such darkness within him? The question haunted her every day, and the pain of knowing that Jessica had been betrayed by someone she had trusted made the grief even harder to bear. For Jessica's children, the discovery of their mother's body marked the end of their childhood innocence. They would grow up without their mother, without the love and guidance she had hoped to provide. The trauma of losing her in such a violent way would stay with them for the rest of their lives. It was a loss that could never be replaced. The news of Jessica's death sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues were left in disbelief. The betrayal and horror were incomprehensible, and many who had known Gregory were stunned by the revelation of his involvement in the crime. He had been seen as a trusted member of the community, a man who had blended in among his peers. Yet behind closed doors, he was capable of the most heinous acts. As investigators worked to piece together the details of the crime, they were left with the grim knowledge that this was not just a murder, it was a violation of the most fundamental trust. Jessica had been murdered by someone who had been entrusted with her safety, someone who had played the role of a father figure and had destroyed everything she had ever known. The weight of that betrayal was unbearable. The discovery of Jessica Padgett's body marked the beginning of a legal battle that would expose the full depth of Gregory's depravity and the horror he had inflicted on his stepdaughter. As the investigators pieced together the timeline of Jessica's last moments and the shocking details of her murder, the case moved into the courtroom, where the horrifying nature of the crime would be laid bare for all to see. But as with every case of this magnitude, the legal proceedings were not just about seeking justice, they were about confronting a reality so vile that it seemed almost unimaginable. Gregory Padgett was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, the disturbing videos found on his computer, the forensic evidence linking him directly to the crime, and the timeline of events all pointed to a chilling premeditation. He had lured Jessica to his home, shot her in cold blood, and then desecrated her body in a manner so depraved it was hard to comprehend. The charges of first-degree murder carried a possible sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, but Gregory's defense team would attempt to mitigate the charges by introducing an argument for third-degree murder. They also sought to have him declared insane, hoping for a reduced sentence or even an insanity plea, but the court would not buy their claims. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with an air of disbelief. The prosecutors laid out the details of the crime in a methodical manner, highlighting not just the brutal murder but the monstrous act that had followed. The prosecution described how Gregory had lured Jessica under the guise of needing help with his computer, how he had shot her execution style in the back of the head, and how he had then violated her lifeless body in a grotesque and depraved act. The details of the crime were horrific, and the prosecution made it clear that Gregory's actions were premeditated, driven by his twisted desires and deep-seated anger toward Jessica. The prosecution's case was bolstered by the evidence collected during the investigation, including the disturbing videos Gregory had filmed. In one of the most gut-wrenching moments of the trial, the jury was shown footage from Gregory's computer. The videos depicted Gregory's abuse of Jessica's body, his complete disregard for her dignity, and his complete lack of remorse. The jury was visibly shaken by the graphic nature of the evidence, but the images only solidified the case against him. Gregory's actions were not the product of a drug-induced blackout or a temporary lapse in judgment. They were calculated, deliberate, and the result of a deeply disturbed mind. Gregory's defense team attempted to argue that he was not fully responsible for his actions. They claimed that he had been under the influence of drugs and alcohol at the time of the murder, and that his actions had been the result of an induced blackout. They also presented an argument for third-degree murder, attempting to reduce the charge to something less than first-degree murder. But these arguments did not resonate with the jury. The defense also sought to have Gregory declared insane, arguing that he had lost touch with reality at the time of the crime. They presented evidence of his psychological history, but it became clear during the trial that Gregory's actions were not the result of a mental breakdown. They were the result of a conscious decision to commit a heinous act. The jury rejected the defense's claims, refusing to be swayed by arguments about his mental state or intoxication. After a trial that lasted several weeks, the jury deliberated for several hours before reaching their verdict. Gregory Padgett was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The verdict was a moment of justice for Jessica and her family, but it did little to heal the wounds left by the brutal crime. The fact that Gregory's actions had been so premeditated, so intentional, only made the verdict feel like a small measure of closure in the face of such incomprehensible horror. As the verdict was read aloud in the courtroom, Donnell, Jessica's mother, broke down in tears. She had fought for justice for her daughter, and while the guilty verdict was a small victory, it was never going to bring Jessica back. The emotional toll on the family was immense, and the trauma of the crime would continue to haunt them long after the legal proceedings were over. The sentencing phase of the trial was just as harrowing as the trial itself. Gregory Padgett was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge addressed Gregory directly, condemning his actions as being beyond any semblance of humanity. The sheer brutality of the crime, the premeditation, and the utter lack of remorse made Gregory a man who would never be fit to re-enter society. The judge also took the time to acknowledge the deep pain inflicted on Jessica's family, particularly her children, who would grow up without their mother. The loss of Jessica was a tragedy that would reverberate through the family for the rest of their lives. The judge's words could not undo the harm Gregory had caused, but they did serve as a reminder that justice had been served. For Jessica's family, the trial was a painful journey, but it was also a necessary one. The legal proceedings gave them the opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives, and it provided them with some measure of justice. However, no court ruling or sentence could bring back Jessica or undo the damage Gregory had inflicted. The emotional aftermath of the trial was immense. Donnell struggled to move forward, her grief complicated by the trauma of knowing that someone she had once loved had committed such a heinous act. For Jessica's children, the pain of losing their mother in such a violent way was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. They would grow up with the shadow of their mother's murder hanging over them, a reminder of the loss they had suffered at the hands of a man who had betrayed their trust. The case also left a profound impact on the community. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues who had known Gregory were left reeling from the revelation of his actions. Many found it difficult to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he had revealed himself to be. The case served as a stark reminder of the dangers of hidden darkness and the importance of vigilance within our own communities. For Jessica's family, the legal victory provided a semblance of justice, but the emotional toll of losing her was something they would never recover from. The fight for justice had been long and painful, but it was the only way they could honor Jessica's memory and ensure that her story was told. After the trial and Gregory Padgett's sentencing, Jessica's family was left to face the heavy emotional toll of her tragic death. Though justice had been served in the courtroom, the scars of the crime were far from healed. For Donnell, Jessica's mother, and her children, the nightmare of betrayal and loss would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The aftermath of this tragedy would not only affect those closest to Jessica, but it would ripple through the community, leaving behind a lingering sense of disbelief, grief, and anger. Jessica's death left an unfillable void in the lives of her family, especially her children. The two boys, who were only young children at the time of her death, would never know their mother in the way they deserved. They would grow up with the heavy burden of knowing their mother had been taken from them in the most horrific way imaginable. Their future would be shaped by the trauma of losing their mother to a man they had once trusted as a family member. Donnell, Jessica's mother, faced a grief like no other. She had not only lost her daughter but had also been betrayed by a man she had loved and trusted. Gregory had been a part of their lives for years, and for Donnell, the revelation of his monstrous actions was a betrayal so deep it was hard to process. The shock of knowing that the man she had once considered a stepfather to her children could commit such an atrocious act left her emotionally shattered. In interviews after the trial, Donnell expressed that the hardest part of dealing with the aftermath was not only the death of her daughter but also the fact that it had been at the hands of someone who was supposed to be a protector, a member of the family. The relationship with Gregory had been one of trust, and now that trust had been violently destroyed, leaving Donnell with an overwhelming sense of disbelief and loss. In the weeks and months that followed the trial, Donnell became an advocate for her daughter's memory, speaking out about the emotional devastation her family had endured. Despite her deep sorrow, she found the strength to publicly share her story in the hope that it would help others understand the true cost of domestic violence and betrayal. Through her grief, Donnell wanted to ensure that Jessica's life was remembered not just for the tragedy of her death, but for the love and life she had shared with her family before that fateful day. The impact on Jessica's children. The children of Jessica Padgett faced the most difficult challenge in the aftermath of her death. Growing up without a mother is painful enough, but knowing that their mother had been murdered by someone so close to them added a layer of trauma that would affect their lives forever. The images of their mother's death, the understanding of how it happened, and the emotional weight of losing her at such a young age would never leave them. A public fundraising campaign was launched by Jessica's friends and family to help support her children, and donations poured in from the community. The generosity of strangers helped ease some of the financial burdens, but it could never replace the love and guidance that Jessica would have given her children as they grew older. The campaign was a testament to how deeply Jessica's life had touched those around her, and how the community rallied to support her children during such a devastating time. Despite the love and support they received, Jessica's children would face years of emotional turmoil. The trauma of losing their mother in such a violent and senseless way would likely leave scars that would last a lifetime. While Jessica's family and friends continued to grieve, they also did everything they could to create a safe and loving environment for her children to grow up in. They tried to shield them from the darker realities of what had happened, offering as much normalcy as possible in the wake of such a traumatic loss. The community in Northampton County, where Jessica had lived and worked, was left reeling from the news of her death. People who had known Jessica were stunned that someone so close to her family could be capable of such a heinous crime. Gregory had been a familiar face in the community, and the realization that he had committed such a crime shook everyone who had interacted with him. Many questioned how they had missed the signs of his dark tendencies and wondered how they could have known the monster he truly was. The tragedy also drew attention to the broader issue of domestic violence and betrayal within families. Jessica's murder was not just the result of a random act of violence, it was a crime that was deeply rooted in the dynamics of a family, where trust had been exploited in the most brutal way. For many in the community, the case served as a harsh reminder of how trust can be so easily violated and how victims of violence are often betrayed by those closest to them. It sparked conversations about the need for greater awareness and intervention in domestic violence situations and highlighted the often hidden danger that can lurk within even the most seemingly ordinary families. Many local residents also shared their disbelief at how someone like Gregory could commit such a crime. He had been a part of the local community for years, known by friends, family, and neighbors. To them, the fact that he could carry out such an atrocity in cold blood was incomprehensible. The case left many wondering how well we can truly know the people around us, even those closest to us, and how easy it is to ignore the warning signs of a person capable of violence. In the wake of Jessica's murder, a fundraising campaign was organized by family and friends to raise money for her children. The response was overwhelming. The community, touched by the tragedy and the devastating loss of a mother and daughter, rallied to support Jessica's children in any way they could. Donations flooded in, and people from all walks of life came together to provide a financial cushion for the children, ensuring they would have a chance to grow up with some semblance of stability. However, while the financial support helped ease some of the burden, it could not replace the loss of Jessica herself. The children's future, marked by such a deep trauma, would be forever shaped by the violent death of their mother. They would have to navigate the complexities of growing up with the weight of knowing that their mother had been taken from them in such a horrifying way. As time passed, Jessica's family continued to honor her memory in different ways. Donnell remained a vocal advocate for her daughter, speaking out about the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of holding perpetrators accountable. Jessica's children, though too young to fully understand the magnitude of what had happened at the time of her death, would grow up with a strong sense of their mother's love and the legacy she had left behind. Through the support of family and friends, they would be guided through their grief, and though their lives would never be the same, they would continue to carry Jessica's memory with them. In the end, the aftermath of Jessica's murder was marked not just by grief, but by the resilience of a family who, despite everything, continued to move forward, driven by a desire to honor the woman they had loved and lost in the most horrific of ways.